Welcome to the instructional video for completing your final project for CS50A. We started in class 13 examining the requirements for our final project. At that time, you were required to create one single HTML page as part of your project proposal, and on this class 12 module, I provided links to the tools that you needed to use to help you create that page. In addition, I provided this instructional video there, and finally I provided two examples of how you could utilize some of the code that was created for you by me for the final project using this multi-column template for the final project proposal. And it should be this size. And all of this was part of class 12, so you're well beyond this at this point, since we are looking at this video around class 16. So you've completed your final project proposal. Moving on to class 13, what we were responsible for doing was to create responsive web pages. And responsive web pages are pages that fit for a desktop display, for a tablet display, for a small little display like a phone, where actually most people view their web pages. More web pages are viewed on mobile devices than on desktops at this point in time. So we had an instructional video there, and in addition, the other things you were supposed to do during class 13 were to create a logo for yourself, and there was an instructional video on how to do that there. And there was sufficient code to discuss with you the use of media queries, like we see right over here, media screen and min width 768. This is going to only apply to screens bigger than 768 pixels wide. This set of rules is only going to apply to screens with a width larger than 1200 pixels. And I also provided you with some more CodePen content where you could use the code that I created, but of course your responsibility was to modify it, changing the styling, the color, the fonts, and of course the content so it fit into what you were going to be creating. So here's again an example, once this page loads, of the content that I created for you on CodePen. So you see our final project template on CodePen, and this one was supposed to be responsive. So you see, as I resize the screen, our columns change to 2 columns on the top and then 1 on the bottom. And when I get it to the size of like a phone, you see it becomes a single column layout with my hyperlinks at the bottom, much easier to read on a small mobile device. So that code was provided for you during class 13. So of course your main requirements for class 13 were to either try to do it completely on your own or modify the code that I had created for you, making sure that you included this set of HTML tags and this set of rules that were being CSS styling rules, right? And the other things, like I said, were the importance and requirement to creating a logo. Moving on to class 14, this is where you were required to organize your data creating a page that utilized tables. And of course, the requirement for the table page was that you utilized tabular data. So the example that I showed several weeks ago was we have a header column, a header row with the various columns below it, and the content in here was tabular data, content that you would find like on a spreadsheet. So your requirement was to create a tables page. So going back to our very first example of content related to our final project, I just want to just jump back to that list of the roadmap list. So at this point, we created our project proposal, we created our logo, we created our responsive multi-column design, we've created our HTML table as one of our pages. And of course, at this point in time, the idea, the concept, the use of your pages and all of the information in your pages should have been related to the scene, the theme that you chose for your final project. This last week, you were responsible for creating a form. So there was a video on the forms page, and that video walked you through the use of the form tag and the various input type tags that you were responsible to use for your form, as well as your text area tag and how you needed to add label elements to all areas of the form, field sets and legends, and set the forms method to post. In addition, it walked you through the process of going to FormSpree to set up the account necessary to create that form. Finally, I provided once again a CodePen set of HTML and CSS that outlined what your form needed to include. And this is here how we see the legend and the field sets. Each one of these are a field set. Here's the legend information at the top of it, and then we have various input types throughout this page, all of which were discussed in the video right over here. So the last week is when you should have created that that form for your website, and that brings us up to this current week. So that brings us to class 16, our second to final class. And at this point, in terms of your final project, you should have a completed draft version for all 5 required pages for your final project. Making sure that each page shares a common set of user interfaces like your navigation system, so it's completely consistent. And if you need to modify the HTML or your CSS code for layout improvements, you do so. All of your pages look exactly the same. So this week, the primary objective is to create a CSS-only interactive drop-down menu. Once again, I've got the code from CodePen that I've created for you to use. And you can see in this example, I've got all of these links that include 2 things that you're going to be doing this next week. One is creating the rollover state, and one is creating the rollover state, and the second is to creating the drop-down portion of the menu. So let's look at the HTML first, and you see I've got the nav tag, and then I've got an unordered list, and I gave it a class name, and I've got list items inside of that unordered list, and then this last 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th list item, you see it says cycling, which is right over here, but the difference here is that this list item has another unordered list as the child of that list item. So essentially, I've got a list inside of a list item, an unordered list, as the child of a list item. And this code here is extremely important for you to understand and to use. It's using the nav tag, but the list itself starts with unordered list, a bunch of list items, and then a list item which has an unordered list nested inside of it. And that list item closes after that unordered list closes, and then 2 more list items. So that's all like pretty self-explanatory. Now, what we have to do is we want to look at 2 portions of this. The first portion has to do with the rollover aspect of that, and the second portion has to do with the interactive drop-down menu. So let's start with really what's the easier part, which is the rollover portion of this. So what we see here is that I've got each of these are hyperlinks, right? So that's the A tag, which stands for anchor, and hyperlink href is a parameter of the anchor tag. But basically, we're looking at the anchor tag when it descends from the list item, when it descends from the unordered list, when it descends from the nav. In other words, this is a descendant selector. And what's important to keep in mind here is that as a descendant selector, all of the other A tags will not utilize these styles because they're not children of this path. Anchor, child of list item, child of unordered list, child of nav, right? So we can see here, A is child of L, I, which is child of U, L, which is child of nav. So anytime we have an anchor that follows that descendant selector path, then we're going to use these rules. They're displayed as block level elements. There's our color. That's our text color, RGB 255, 255, 255. That means it's white. Background color is that red that we see below. I set the text transform to uppercase, text decoration to none, so there's no underlining of the hyperlinks. I've set some padding around it, and I've text aligned everything to the center. But that isn't what gives us the rollover state. The rollover state is this next set of rules right here, where we see nav a colon hover. That is an example of a pseudo class. You've used pseudo classes before, like the nth child rules. This is another example of a pseudo class. So nav a colon hover, and nav a colon active, and nav a colon focus. This is a multiple selector. So the rules that we see below are going to apply in the hover state when the element is active and when the focus is on that element. Now, what we see here is we change the background color to this color, and we change the text color to this color. So when I roll over these elements, we see that's what happens. So the background color is changing in the hover state. The text color is changing as well in the hover state. And if I wanted to make that, like darker, I would go over here. I could probably do. So now, when I roll over this, that text is very dark, right? So I'm not going to do that. I don't think it works as well. So I'll leave it like that. But the point is that this pseudo class is what gives you the rollover state, right? The hover right there is what we're getting. And when I click on it, of course it doesn't go anywhere because the link doesn't go anywhere. But when I click on it, it also assumes that hover state because it's also the active state and the focus state. Then I have another little portion, which is not really important for me to spend any time right now. We're just going to skip that for now. But the main thing is that you want to know how to do the hover state. So that is the kind of summary of how we create a rollover state, which makes it look nice like this. Now let's talk about how we create this, this interactive element of our menu. And this has to do with the fact that this unordered list here has a class name of dropdown. So what we're doing in this class name of dropdown is we're saying when the unordered list descends from the list item as part of dropdown, set the display to none. So that's not this unordered list here. It's unordered list when it descends from a list item. That's this one. When this unordered list descends from this list, from a list item, and it is the child of the drop-down class, then by default set the display to none. That's why we are not seeing these 5 links right now, because by default the display is set to hidden or none. The position is set to absolute, and if that's the case, then that means the parent of this unordered list has to have its position set to relative, right? So if we look up above here, we see that position set to relative right here. The list item as the child of unordered list has its position set to relative. So because of the fact that there's an unordered list that's the child of list item, then and its position is set to absolute, it's going to be positioned in relationship to its parent, which is this list item. Okay? So we see the display is set to none, the position is set to absolute, and we set the margin top right against the top of the parent right there. That's why these list elements are exactly below. If we had set this margin top to 10, for example, let's take a look at what happens here. There's that space. And what happens is then when we roll over that space, we are no longer in the hover state, so we lose that menu. So that's why it's important that that margin top is set to 0. So now we go back here, we do that again, and we can navigate that whole list. There's no padding. The Z index means that it's going to appear on top of any other elements that might be on that. If there was text or pictures here, this drop-down list would be in front of those pictures because the Z index is the depth index, okay? And the width of the elements is set to 40%. Now, what we have to keep in mind is the display is currently set to none. So when does this drop-down list actually appear? Well, let's take a look. Down over here, we have the drop-down when the list item is being hovered over, the unordered list displays to block. That's the key. When the list item is of the drop-down class unordered list here, when that list item, which is the child of that, and there's only one that has an unordered list descending from it, when we hover over that list item, then the unordered list suddenly has its display property set to something other than none. In this case, it's set to block. And that's why we see that. When we roll off of it, it gets displayed back to none again. So that's how our interactive menu appears. But there are a couple of other things we have to notice here. We're looking at this on a large screen, so this style sheet has a media query set that says when the screen is bigger than 768 pixels, set the flex direction of this unordered list to row. That's what we're seeing here. If we were looking at this on a small screen, this would be set to column. So let's take a look. See, it becomes column at a width of less than 768 pixels. So that media query is extremely important to understand that at a screen size larger than 768 pixels, the flex direction of this unordered list, which is a child of nav, is set to row. And the list items are set to flex auto, which means no matter how many list items we have, we're going to have room for all of them. So for example, if I took out this about list item over here, everything resizes on the page to make it work for that scenario. So that's let's see, I want to do that. The other thing that's important to see in this media query is that the unordered list has its width set to 100%. And that's what we're seeing, that this unordered list is 100% of its parent's width, right? Its parent's width is this list item. Remember, we talked about up here that it's this position is set to absolute because its parent has its position set to relative right over here. So that width of 100% is in relationship to its parent right right there. So each of these list items, that's 100% width of that element. You might have noticed earlier that we saw that the drop-down unordered list menu was set to a width of 40%. Remember, this is the mobile first set of rules. In other words, the media query below here overrides that width of 40% when the screen gets bigger than 768 pixels. So once we go down to a small screen size, what you'll see in the cycling is that the width of each of those interactive menu list items is 40%. And the reason is so that you don't cover up the rest of the links, right? Because if I have this set to 100%, then it would it would cover up both of the about and the contact links. So that is the set of those are the two things that you have to work on this week: the hover navigation system and the interactive drop-down menu. Now, do these have to go anyplace? They don't have to operate. I just have to see them on every page so I can see that you know how to create an interactive drop-down menu. So as it says over here, you have to start. You can use the example code that I just showed you. The menu may be triggered by hover or click interaction by the user. Style the drop-down menu using an external style sheet. So that code that I gave you there, you would need to put into one of your style sheets, okay? And you'll want to just review all of the content here. That the rules at the top of the page of your style sheet are your mobile first rules. The media queries happen later on, and you only need to add rules that are going to override the rules that work for the website in its entirety. For example, the the menu, horizontal menu for a widescreen and a vertical menu for a narrow screen. The final part of this video is going to open up PCM, Phoenix Code Editor, PCE, and just take a quick look at my example website. So I'm inside a Phoenix Code Editor, and I have my final project complete over here. I have all of my assets in various folders in here to keep things organized. That includes images and then other images inside of each of these folders, as well as videos and things like that. I have my I have 6 pages. You are required for 5. I've got my index page, my education page, my diving page. These are all the pages that you see highlighted up over here. You see, I, in addition, have a CSS folder where I have a default CSS file, and then on certain pages like my contact page, I have additional styling that shows up in my form CSS. So how would that work? Well, let's take a look at the index page first. We see I have a link to my default style sheet. But when I go to my form page or my contact page, and we see this is my form right here, I have my link to my default style sheet, but I have some additional styles that only occur on my forms page, so I put them in a separate form style sheet. Let's take a look at how the entire website works on a browser like Chrome. So here I am on my home page. We see I have multiple columns. I have information about myself. And then when I size this down, because of the fact that this is responsive, when I get to the size of a typical tablet, I have 2 columns on the top and then it breaks down to have single columns below that. When I get it to the size of like a mobile device like a phone, well, I want to stack everything on top of each other so we can see it easily, and I put my links at the bottom for when I'm in a phone environment. And we can see my drop-down menu, my interactive menu shows up down over here. It's a little tricky to get to in that scenario. Let's go back to the full size. We see my navigation system works in terms of my rollover states changing, and then I have these hyperlinks to these other pages inside of this drop-down menu, which is the interactive menu. Again, these don't have to work. I just have to be able to see them on all of your pages. So like, for example, when I go to my education page, that's where it doesn't work inside of the navigator like this. I'll go back over here and I will link, I'll just open up the education page right here. I had to fix a couple little HTML errors. I didn't have a closing HTML tag, but when I launch this in my browser, we see here is where we have a use of the tables page. The color is different. I haven't changed this one to match the rest of my website. Then I have a link here to my music page, my travel page, my diving page, and my contact us page. And I'll go back over to here and taking a look at the music page. We'll see that I've got information related to that subject as well. So the main thing that you'll notice here is on each of these pages, the logo's in the exact same place, right? Every page, everything really looks solidly like the last page. And that's the main thing that we're looking for, is to make sure that there is that consistency on the website, right? And I've got a video in here, and when we size this down, you'll see that video will stay properly sized for the mobile device because I set those rules as my mobile first rules. And finally, so there's our 6 pages. Now I'm going to go back to finish up right here in Phoenix Code Editor to just go over what it is that I expect you to have, aside from what I've already talked about. You want to have a final project that contains everything in a single parent folder, all of your style sheets, all of your assets, and then you're at least 5 pages with your navigation system completely locked down so it works seamlessly on all of the pages. And next week I will post the final video on adding interactive elements to your website, but this should give you everything you need to have in order to really make a very powerful and successful final project.